Welcome to episode 9 of Matthewlinity, critical study of Matthew and masculinity. In this series, I'll be navigating the world of Matthean research, identifying assumptions, connecting old and new interpretations, including questions and perspectives previously overlooked or undervalued. There's a whole world of research that awaits. Are you ready? This episode is about the parallel story to how Joseph almost does not become known as the father of Jesus, because he thought it would not be right for him to claim to be the father of Mary's child, nor to pursue marital relations with Mary. There's actually a parallel story that for some reason we haven't previously studied, even though it's such a close story parallel. Much closer than the apocryphal story of Noah's birth or the apocryphal story of Moses' conception. So it's time to study this story parallel, and to help answer the question of why Matthew chapter 1 verses 18 to 25 is so focused on Joseph. What Joseph is doing, what Joseph is not doing, what Joseph is told to do, what he ends up doing or not doing. Why is it so focused on Joseph? Verse 3 of Matthew chapter 1 has already dropped a hint as to what the story parallel is, so I'll begin reading aloud the relevant portions of Matthew chapter 1, in this case, the first 3 verses and then verses 18 to 25. Book of the Progeneration of Jesus the Messiah, heir of David, heir of Abraham. Abraham progenerated Isaac. Isaac progenerated Jacob. Jacob progenerated Judah and his brothers. Judah progenerated Perez and Zerah from Tamar. The progeneration of the Jesus Messiah was this way. His mother Mary, being betrothed to Joseph, before they came together, her having a pregnant belly from the Holy Spirit became apparent. Joseph, her husband, being righteous and not wanting to shame her, decided he would divorce her quietly. Having resolved to do these things, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream, saying, Joseph, son of David, do not be afraid to take Mary, your wife, for her child is from the Holy Spirit. She will give birth to a son. You shall call his name Jesus, for he shall save his people from their sins. This whole thing occurred so as to be a fulfillment of that which was spoken by the Lord through the prophet, saying, Behold, the virgin shall have a pregnant belly, she shall give birth to a son. They shall call his name Emmanuel, which, translated, is God is with us. Joseph, rising from sleep, did as was commanded to him by the angel of the Lord. He took his wife. He was not knowing her up till the time she gave birth to a son. He called his name Jesus. Why is it so focused on what Joseph is doing or what Joseph is not doing? We could even see it in verse 24, where it refers to the lack of sexual intercourse, which we've already been told previously, and it tells us again that there's a lack of sexual intercourse between Mary and Joseph, but this time it says he did not have sex with her, which is we didn't need to be told it as if it's sounding like it's Joseph's decision to refrain from having sex. It's Joseph's decision to abstain. Why are we keeping on focusing on Joseph so much? This whole story seems to be about what Joseph is intending to do, and then what Joseph is told to do, and then what Joseph ends up doing. So what Joseph is doing and not doing seems to be all about Joseph, this entire story. Now, if we're wondering, well, why? Why is it about Joseph so much? Well, the short answer we can quite easily see is, well, it comes after this patrilineal genealogy that led all the way up to Joseph, and then it suggested that Joseph was not the biological father of Jesus. So Jesus seems to be inheriting Joseph. Jesus seems to be the heir of Joseph somehow, even though he's not the biological heir. So how does it happen? How does the father-son relationship work out so that Jesus becomes Joseph's heir? Or another way of saying it is Joseph becomes Jesus' father. And now we don't normally think of it this way, but it's the same thing, really. How Jesus becomes Joseph's son is how Joseph becomes Jesus' father. But for some reason we don't tend to see that. Well, that's the more accurate representation that we've got here. It's about how does Joseph become Jesus' father. So we've got a story about Joseph who does not look like he's going to claim paternity rights. He doesn't think he has a right to claim paternity rights. He and Mary have not even begun a sexual relationship yet. It wouldn't be right to claim Mary as his wife and the child as his child. He's not going to claim paternity or marital rights at all. That's the plan. And then, well, he's told, no, don't worry, there's no problem. He can do that. So Joseph thought that it would be wrong to do so. He thought that the right thing would be to divorce quietly, to not say that he's not the father, but to not claim to be the father. It's a very careful. He wants to be very careful to not make things worse. Wants to be discreet, to sort of step aside quietly. So he doesn't think it's right. He doesn't think it's right to go ahead. So in the end, it ends up going ahead only because he's told to go ahead. So we end up with the story of, well, how did it work out that Joseph did go ahead and claim paternity rights? And he claims that Mary as his wife and the child as his child. How does that eventuate? Well, the more that we see that verse 16 is connected to the second part of Matthew chapter 1, the second part of Matthew chapter 1 is following on from verse 16, which had introduced the relationship between Jesus, Mary, and Joseph. And we have the story in verse 18 to 25. How did it work out? How did Joseph become the father of Jesus? So that's the short answer of why it's so focused on Joseph. Now, there is another attempt by scholars to point out some parallel stories, some similar stories where we have some kind of jeopardized paternity. So the paternity is jeopardized either before conception or after the birth. So, for example, the apocryphal story of Moses almost not being conceived because Moses' parents were potentially going to be divorced. Well, it's a story of Moses' father deciding not to divorce Moses' mother when other men were getting together, deciding that they were all going to divorce their wives. They're all going to have a mass separation. So this is at the point. This is not part of the book of Exodus, but this is the apocryphal version that takes place when the Egyptians are killing the boys, the baby boys, and so the fathers have a meeting and they decide to stop procreating. So they say let's all separate from our wives and stop procreating. It's just not right if the babies are going to be thrown into the Nile. And Moses' father stands up and says, actually, no, I don't think it would be right to divorce our wives and stop procreating. I think that would be complying. That would be complicit to the genocide by just giving up. So he says he's going to go home and go home to his wife and have marital relations, keep procreating. And he encourages the other men to do the same. Well, the story fluctuates according to many different versions. The story appears in many different versions. In one version, it's Moses' older sister Miriam who tells him not to divorce the mother. So it's his daughter that tells him. In another version, Miriam is not born yet because the parents have not yet gotten married, and the father's contemplating whether or not to get married. So the parents are contemplating whether or not to get married. In another version, I think they separate and then they get back together by remarrying each other. So there's lots of different versions of like whose idea it was to separate or to not separate. So some scholars like to point out that, well, there's a bit of a parallel there to our story about there's the potential for divorce, which would jeopardize the whole conception and birth of Moses. So that's similar. Some people like to point out, well, there's a parallel, a little bit of a parallel there. Other scholars like to point out the apocryphal story of Noah's birth and how Noah's father thought that he was not Noah's father when he saw Noah born, and Noah was speaking and prophesying. Noah's father freaked out and thought that he wasn't the father. And so he's not going to claim this child as his child. He doesn't know what to do really. But then he ends up getting a prophecy from Methuselah, I think, indicating that Noah is his child. Noah's going to bring some kind of salvation, and also Noah's mother reminds Noah's father of the time 9 months previously that they conceived, that they made, that they had sexual relations. So he's reminded of that, and so it all works out, and the paternity is resolved. So there's a couple of parallels here that we could find, and the topic of porneia also comes up in that story, unsanctioned sexual unions, because Noah's mother is accused by Noah's father of porneia, and the topic of porneia does come up in Matthew chapter 1. Well, some people think that Joseph is accusing Mary of porneia, that's not quite correct. He doesn't think it's right for him to pursue marital relations with Mary. He thinks that pursuing marital relations with Mary would be porneia. But the topic of porneia does come up. So there's a couple of parallel aspects, a couple of parallel points in the story, the apocryphal story of the birth of Noah. However, there is a better parallel, a much better parallel. We don't need to try to find parallels in the apocryphal stories of Noah and Moses. I mean, even though those stories are well known in the first century, and yes, perhaps readers and hearers of Matthew would have known those stories, but they wouldn't really be thinking of those as the closest parallels. There's a much closer parallel. In fact, there's a story that contains so many parallels with the story of Joseph, Mary, and Jesus. It's unbelievable that we haven't seen these parallels earlier. In fact, there's even a word-for-word quotation where the same expression happens. And that expression is, he did not know her. So if we were wondering, how do we interpret this phrase, this expression, where it says that Joseph still had not had sex with Mary, in verse 24, when it says he did not know her prior to the time she gave birth to a son, when it says he did not know her, that's a word-for-word expression that also turns up in the parallel, or there's one of many parallel moments that we find with this story. So what is the story? It's the story that we find in Genesis 38. Genesis 38 is the story of how Judah produced Perez and Zerah from Tamar. That is the story that we find the same expression and a whole bunch of other parallels. Now, all of the parallels are found within about 3 verses in Genesis chapter 38. So it's a long chapter that most of it's not paralleled, but then there comes a point in the story where there is a bunch of parallels where it starts to sound more and more like Matthew chapter 1. Or I should say the other way around. Matthew chapter 1, verses 18 to 25, starts to sound more like Genesis chapter 38. So I'm going to read aloud Genesis chapter 38, and I encourage listeners to listen out for at what point in the story does it become parallel? Where are the parallels? Listen out for them. There's some corresponding points to look out for. But yeah, the first part of Genesis chapter 38 it's obviously there's nothing in common for a long time, and I just feel like I'll read the entire chapter. It doesn't feel fair just to pick out the 3 verses that are parallel. It doesn't really do justice to the context of the story. So it's a nice standalone story. Genesis chapter 38. Well, it obviously connects with the other chapters in Genesis as well, but it can be read as a standalone story, a very clear story of how it was that Judah became the father of Perez and Zerah from Tamar. Now it happened at that time that Judah went down from his brothers and arrived as far as a certain Adulamite man, whose name was Hira. And there Judah saw a Canaanite man's daughter, whose name was Shua, and he took her as wife, and he had intercourse with her. She conceived, and bore a son, and called his name And after she had conceived again, she bore a son, and called his name Onan. And further again, she bore a son, and she called his name Shelah. Now she was in Kesbi when she bore them. And Judah took for his firstborn, a wife, whose name was Tamar. But Judah's firstborn, happened to be wicked in the sight of the Lord, and God killed him. Then Judah said to Onan, "Go, have intercourse with your brother's wife, and do as a brother-in-law does by raising up offspring for your brother." But because Onan knew that the offspring would not be his, he would spill his semen on the ground during intercourse with his brother's wife, so that he would not give offspring to his brother. It was seen to be evil in the sight of God that he did this, and God put him to death too. Then Judah said to Tamar, his daughter-in-law, "Go live as a widow in the house of your father until my son Shelah is grown big." Judah said this to prevent Shelah's expected death like his brothers. Having departed, Tamar stayed in the house of her father. Time went on, and the wife of Judah, Shua, died. And after Judah had been comforted, he went up to Timnah, to those who were shearing his sheep, he and the shepherd of his, Hira the Adulamite. And this was reported to his daughter-in-law Tamar. "Behold, your father-in-law is going up to Timnah to shear his sheep." And taking off the garments of her widowhood, she put on a light-weight garment, and adorned herself, and sat down near the gates of Ainan, which is on the way past Timnah, for she saw that Shelah was now grown up. Yet Judah still did not give her to him as wife. And when Judah saw her, he thought she was a prostitute, for she had changed her look, and he did not recognize her. Then he turned aside to her from the path, and said to her, "Allow me to have intercourse with you," for he did not know that she was his daughter-in-law. And she said, "What will you give me for having intercourse with me?" And he said, "I will send to you a young goat from the flocks." And she said, "If you give a pledge until you send it." And he said, "What pledge shall I give to you?" And she said, "Your ring, and your neckband, and the staff that is in your hand." And he gave them to her. And he had intercourse with her, and she became pregnant from him. And rising up, she went away, and she took off her lightweight garment and put on the garments of her widowhood. Now Judah sent the young goat from the goats by the hand of his shepherd the Edolamite to recover the pledge from the woman, and he did not find her. Then he asked the men of the place, "Where is the prostitute who was at Ainan by the road?" And they said, "There was no prostitute here." And he returned to Judah and said, "I did not find her, and the people of the place say that there was no prostitute there." And Judah said, "Well, let her have them, but let us not be laughed at. I've done my part. I've sent this young goat, but you have not found her." Now it happened, after a few months, that it was reported to Judah, "Your daughter-in-law Tamar has prostituted herself, and behold, she has a pregnancy from her prostitution." Then Judah said, "Bring her to be burned." But as she was being brought, she sent a message to her father-in-law, saying, "I have a pregnancy from the man whose things these are." And she said, "Notice whose is the ring, and the neckband, and this staff." Then Judah acknowledged them and said, "Tamar has been proven right over me, because I did not give her to my son Shelah." And he did not again know her. Now it happened at the time when she gave birth that she had twins in her belly, and it happened during giving birth that one twin put his hand out, and taking it, the midwife bound red material on his hand, saying, "This one will come out first." But when he retracted his hand, then immediately out came his brother. And she said, "What sort of a barrier has been cut through because of you?" And she called his name Perez. And afterward his brother came out, upon whom was the red material on his hand, and she called his name Zerah. Okay, so if you're familiar with Genesis 38, you probably would have noticed that there's a little bit of difference in the English version that I'm using with the English version that you might be more familiar with, or the Hebrew version if you're familiar with the 10th century Hebrew version. And that's because I've been reading an English version that's based on the Greek version of an older Hebrew version. There's not a lot of differences, but you might have picked up that perhaps the biggest difference was that when it said she veiled her face, or she covered her face with a veil, that we don't have that in the Greek version. In the Greek version, it's that she changed her look. She obscured her face with makeup and well, maybe also a veil. It doesn't really mention a veil in how she's changing her identity so that she doesn't look like herself. That's perhaps the biggest difference. So there's not really a lot of other differences to worry about. But so I think I was thinking that, well, whoever is listening to Matthew being read in the first century in Greek is probably already, if they're hearing the book of Genesis being read, they're probably also familiar with that being read in Greek. So I thought, it would make sense to go back, rather than just presuming that everyone who's listening to Matthew in Greek would also have known the Hebrew version, which they may well have known the Hebrew version, but it seemed to be obvious that if they're listening to Matthew in Greek and reading Matthew in Greek, then I'll go to the Greek version. That it seemed to be more natural to do that. All right, so did you spot the points of correspondence? Did you spot where the parallels were? There comes a point in the story where, just as Mary is pregnant and Joseph realizes that he's got to decide what he's going to do, similarly in the story of Judah realizing that Tamar is pregnant, and he makes a decision about what to do. But there's a whole bunch of correspondences right at that moment, so I'll go through them. Okay, so at this point of the story, there's a similar setup that's happening. There's a similar scenario where there's a woman who is betrothed, who is waiting to enter the man's household, waiting for the man to decide that she can enter his household. And then the man finds out that the woman, the betrothed woman, is already pregnant. And she's already pregnant to an unknown father. And then so the man makes a decision about what to do. So we've already had several parallels just within the moment of pregnancy becoming noticeable. The moment that pregnancy is noticeable, we realized, both pregnancies are with a betrothed woman who's waiting to enter the man's household, waiting for the man to decide, and the man finds out that the woman's already pregnant and that the pregnancy is unknown. The man doesn't know who the father of the child is. And so then the man makes a decision about what to do, but then that decision is overridden by some new information, and then there's a new outcome. So the man's plan isn't carried out at all. So the new outcome is that the man is conferred with the status of fatherhood. So we have this surprise paternity aspect, which both stories have. So we have so many parallels here. I mean, even if we just limit them down to the woman betrothed waiting to enter the household, the man finds out the woman's already pregnant, the pregnancy is an unknown father, the man makes a decision, the decision is overridden, and then the new outcome confers the man with status of paternity. If we just limit it down to those 6 points, that's 6 parallels that we find just there. And there's more. That's just the beginning. So it's really remarkable that we haven't spotted this before. But we've got 6 parallels here. Now, the point of having parallels is to set up a scenario to show that there's something to notice. What's the point? Like, okay, so what that the stories are similar? Well, the point of having something so similar is to show the difference. I know that sounds a little bit counterintuitive, but the differences can only be spotted once we see the similarities. Obviously, when there's just complete differences, there's no comparisons. But once you've got similarities that are drawn, then the comparisons can be made. So the similarities are there in order to draw attention to what's different. It's not just to point out things that, look at that, happen to be similar. But what are the differences within the similarities? So this is where we notice a contrast, a really, like a big contrast that's happening. So if we look at the big difference between these two stories, the man, in the case of Judah's story with Tamar, the man Judah, he responds a certain way, and it's in complete contrast to Joseph from Matthew chapter 1. So we have a complete contrast with Joseph's response when we compare it to Judah's response. So the situation is set up to be similar so that we can spot the difference of response for the man in each case. Okay, so I'd like to point out 3 aspects to the response. I mean, we could go more complicated as well and really get into the different motivation of the response, but the 3 things that stand out that are just obvious in the difference to the response. Judah's response, how Judah responds to Tamar's pregnancy, and Joseph in Matthew chapter 1, how Joseph responds to Mary's pregnancy. Okay, so if we think of the 3 aspects that are the most noticeable. The time of the response, how speedy, how quick, or how slow the response is. The publicity of the response, so to do with the public nature or private nature of the response. And who is judged? Like, is the woman being judged or criticized? What's the assumption of judgment that's being made? So these are three main aspects that are being contrasted. So, number one, time. The response in terms of the time that Judah takes. Well, Judah hears and responds immediately. So Judah's response is abrupt and blunt, but without getting into the harshness of the response. Just in terms of just the time taken of the response. Judah's response is quick. It's quick. It's rushed. Now, notice the contrast with Joseph. Joseph's response is that, well, he's realized and he's considered what to do. He resolves what he will do. He's aware of what he should do and what he should not do, and he decides what action to take after he's considered the options. And then he goes to sleep before acting on anything. So we've got quite a contrasted response here in terms of the time taken to respond. All right, now let's look at the public nature of the response. Judah responds publicly. He speaks publicly. He calls for a public response by asking others to bring out Tamar so that she can be publicly burnt. So burnt in public. Like, this is very, very public kind of response that Judah is having. Everything is just very, very public. In contrast, Joseph does not want to go public. He doesn't want a public response. He doesn't want to say anything. He's not saying anything in public. He's not calling for a public response. He's not expecting the public to be involved in what's going on at all. So we have this clear contrast again, where it's saying that Joseph doesn't want to publicly shame Mary. In fact, he's deciding that what would be best would be a private response, a private divorce, so that there's that word that's the opposite of public. All right. Okay, now the third aspect is the judgmental nature that Judah has towards Tamar. So Judah is standing in judgment over Tamar. He's demonstrating a judgmental opinion. He judges Tamar to be guilty of porneia. So all the guilt, it's all Tamar's fault. Get rid of Tamar because it's her fault. So it's a very judgmental attitude. Whereas Joseph shows no such judgment of Mary. There's no blame of Mary found in the story. Compared to Judah, there's just an absence of Mary being judged. Instead, Joseph is thinking about his own actions. He's critical of his own potential to be doing something wrong. If he were to be claiming Mary as his wife and marital rights and paternity rights, it just would not be right to claim to be in a sexual relationship with Mary and to pursue a sexual relationship with Mary and to be claiming to be the father of her unborn child. No, that wouldn't be right. Joseph does not feel at all that is right. Maybe in the eyes of the public, he could easily get away with it. It would not be right. But what about the eyes of God? No, that doesn't seem right. Without permission to go ahead, he's not going to go ahead. Yes, so if Joseph were to go ahead, that would be his actions introducing something wrong. That would be, will his own actions be making things worse? Will it be introducing something wrong into the relationship? What would be the wrong thing or the right thing for Joseph himself to be doing? So it's a very different kind of attitude that Judah has. So if we were ever wondering about, maybe Joseph in Matthew chapter 1, maybe Joseph is a little bit critical of Mary. No, we can see it quite clearly now here when we've got the clear contrast being set up with all of these similarities in order to point out that the contrast is, how does the man respond to the woman's pregnancy? So in the case of Judah, it's rushed, it's rash, it's public, and it's judgmental. In the case of Joseph, it's considered. It's private, it's discreet, it's non-judgmental, it's self-critical rather than critical of the woman. All right, so this is a lot to take in because these are very important parallels. We've got parallels that are clearly paralleled, and then we have these contrasts which are inverted parallels. So the similarities are there in order to highlight the contrast, the difference between Judah's response to Tamar's pregnancy and Joseph's response to Mary's pregnancy. But how do we hold all of this together? Like, what's the point? I mean, is this just like a clever way of telling the story to make it sound like what was going on with Judah is somehow similar to what was going on with Joseph? I mean, so what? Why are we being told all of this? Now, the bigger so what question, the why question, is what we'll be getting into next time in episode 10. That's we're almost there. We're getting a little bit into the why aspect now. So the what questions and the how questions eventually will lead up into the why questions. But at the moment, if we can just stick to the how question for a little bit longer and notice an interesting thing with the word-for-word expression that happens, because both stories have a moment in the story where it says, he did not know her. What does this expression mean in Matthew chapter 1? And what does it mean in Genesis 38? And what is the connection? Why do we have an apparent link between the two stories using the same expression? I think it'll be helpful to begin with the variety of expressions that we've got in Matthew chapter 1. Just in verses 18 to 25, we have three varieties of expression to indicate the same thing. So verse 18 and verse 19 and verse 24 are all indicating something to do with the lack of reproductive activity. We find that there are 3 times in this story unit of Matthew chapter 1 where it's indicating a lack of sexual intercourse. No marital relations. But let's have a look at the kind of language that is used in the text. So verses 18 to 25 of Matthew chapter 1. What are the 3 kinds of language being used? So we can see that in verse 18, it's the language of sexual union. It uses the language of united. It says before they became united, before there was a sexual union. And in verse 19, it's referring to the lack of sexual intercourse by using the language that's opposite of marital relations. So Joseph is wanting to avoid having marital relations. He doesn't want to take Mary home and pursue marital relations. So he's wanting to pursue going the opposite way. He's, rather than pursuing marital relations, he's pursuing separation. So here we have the language that is the opposite of marital relations. And then finally in verse 24, we have the language of sexual knowledge. So it's the word for knowing, when it says he did not know her. We've got three different ways of indicating the same thing, of indicating that there is no sexual intercourse between Mary and Joseph. So the question of why does it say he did not know her in verse 24, we can break that question down into 3 questions. And 2 of the questions we've kind of already answered. So is there any sexual intercourse between Mary and Joseph? No. It's telling us again for the 3rd time. it's making it super clear that no, it's not Joseph's biological offspring. It's not Joseph's. That's just in case we might be thinking, well, yes, but what if Mary miscarried and then the child that she ended up having was Joseph's child? Because what if people weren't counting the months correctly and it was actually Joseph's child that she ended up giving birth to? Well, no, it's making it super clear that no, it's not Joseph's biological offspring. It's making it super clear. So yeah, that's the first thing that we can see, that this is why it's being told to us for a third time, just to make that super clear. And we can also see that, well, why does it say he did not have sex with her rather than they did not have sex with each other? It's because we've got a parallel story that it's linking it with the parallel story by using the same language as it used in Genesis 38. So if we're wanting to know what that means in Matthew chapter 1, it might be helpful to have a look at what it means in Genesis 38. Well, the first time it's used in Genesis chapter 38, it's in verse 16, I think, where it's referring to the fact that Judah is propositioning Tamar for sex, just like she's anticipated and set up to happen. And it says he did not know her to be his daughter-in-law. And then the second time that the expression is used in Genesis 38 is just prior to the time that Tamar gives birth. So just prior to that mention of the birth report, it says, thereafter, he did not know her again. Now, already, if we compare this usage with how it's happening in Matthew chapter 1, where it says, he did not know her prior to the time that she gave birth to a son. So in that sentence that we've got in Matthew, it's connected to a time clause. And in fact, both of them are connected to time clause. In the case of Judah, it's connected to the time where from then onwards he did not know her. Whereas in the case of Joseph from Matthew chapter 1, it's connected to, well, prior to the point where Mary gave birth, he did not know her. So they're both connected to a time phrase, and those time phrases are opposite. So here we have the same expression where the similarity is in the same sentence as the dissimilarity. So the similarity is the dissimilarity. The similarity is that he did not know her. In the case of Judah, it's referring to a time after the story, the main story has just taken place. And in the case of Joseph, in Matthew chapter 1, it's up till the end of the story episode. Yeah, so what else is going on in this phrase in Genesis chapter 38 that might be relevant to compare with Matthew chapter 1? Well, if we think about what it means for Judah, it means that, well, he previously had known Tamar in a certain way, and now that way is not going to continue again. That's not again going to happen. Now that he knows that it was Tamar that he knew, he's no longer going to know Tamar in that way ever again. So there's a shift. In the case of Judah, there's a shift in the kind of not knowing, whereas for Joseph in Matthew chapter 1, it's not a shift in the kind of not knowing. It's a consistency that so far Joseph has not had sexual intercourse with Mary, and he's still not going to be having sexual intercourse with Mary at this point of the story, even though it seems like he might have been able to pursue that if he had have wanted to, perhaps, but it's still not going to be happening. So in Joseph's case, there's a consistency that we find in verse 18, no sexual intercourse between Mary and Joseph. Verse 19, Joseph's not going to pursue marital relations with Mary. And verse 24, Joseph is still not pursuing sexual intercourse. So it's very consistent in the case of Joseph. Also, we can look at how there's something that converges in the two stories at this point. So the reason to use the same expression is to highlight the convergence. There's something converging at this point. Because in the case of Judah, this is the point where he suddenly gets his act together and stops behaving so unrighteously and starts behaving righteously. So it makes sense that for Judah, it would be telling us he did not thereafter he did not know her again. So it's part of this turnaround for Judah getting his act together and taking responsibility for his own actions and not doing things that he could, maybe he could get away with. But the point is for him to grow up a bit, become a bit more mature, take responsibility for himself, start thinking about, he's going to stop bossing people around. And so there's a big shift for Judah at this point. It's a big turnaround. So he's just realized that he has been behaving unrighteously. He's been treating Tamar unrighteously. And so it's part of this shift where it's like a repentant moment for Judah has just happened. Judah has just declared that it's not Tamar that's in the wrong. Tamar has been in the right. He's implicated himself as being in the wrong. So that's just happened. And then it says this line, thereafter, he did not know her again. So it's part of this big turnaround for Judah becoming righteous. Now, this is why we can see that in the case of Joseph, in Matthew chapter 1, it's part of the consistency that Joseph has already been behaving righteously consistently all the way through this story episode. So it's a convergence where something righteous is happening in the case of Judah and in the case of Joseph. The stories are converging. This is at the point where, in the case of Judah, it starts to behave righteously, but in the case of Joseph, there's the convergence because he's already been behaving righteously. We can also see that there are other aspects to the not knowing as well. It's actually quite a multifaceted expression where it says he did not know her. There's many other facets to what's going on. Because if we think of how Judah had consistently misperceived who Tamar was, there's a lot in the story of Genesis chapter 38 about Judah misperceiving Tamar, until the point where Tamar finally takes advantage of the misperception, and she deliberately is misperceived in order to be able to get the child that she keeps getting promised. So she figures out a way of deliberately being misperceived. And then so when it says he did not know her thereafter, it's referring to Judah did not know Tamar really the first time. I mean, he just didn't know that it was her. He knew someone who he thought was not Tamar. And then obviously it turns out that it was Tamar all along. And so when it says he did not know her again, it's kind of like it's more than a double play. I was going to say a double play, where he knew her before, but now he doesn't know her again. But there's a consistency in the fact that he never really knew her, so he's not going to know her anymore. Again, in terms of, well, not in the same way, but again, also in terms of the knowing is a different kind of knowing. The not knowing is a different kind of not knowing that continues. It's a very clever line in Genesis chapter 38. It summarizes really well what was going on with Judah. And Judah misperceiving Tamar, and how he finally perceives. It's basically a recognition scene that we have. And what we've got in Matthew chapter 1 is it's utilizing the same kind of recognition scene in terms of Judah recognizing that he was actually the father. He discovers that, he is the father. And Joseph is discovering that he is the father, even though he was right to assume that he was not the father. And so it's drawing attention to the different kind of not knowing being consistently a good kind of not knowing. It was good that Joseph didn't know. It was good that Joseph didn't pursue to know Mary when he had the chance, according to the public opinion, to just go for it, just to take Mary home and pursue marital relations with Mary. He decided, no, that wouldn't be right. And in fact, we're told that that's correct. That would not be right. Without permission to do so, Joseph would have been wrong to pursue marital relations with Mary. That would have been wrong. And so we often miss that point. But now that we can compare the two stories, we can see the contrast where Judah is behaving unrighteously up until the point where he realizes that, oh, Tamar is not wrong. He is wrong. Tamar is right. He is wrong. And so he starts acting righteously. And in Joseph's case in Matthew chapter 1, there's already the righteousness there all the way through. Every time it says that there's a lack of sexual pursuit on Joseph's part of Mary, then it's saying, well, that's correct. It's showing the very respectful nature. So in the case of Judah, Judah is suddenly being respectful and not trying to just get away with whatever he can get away with. Whereas Joseph's already been that kind of right acting man to not try and get away with what he can get away with, but to act rightly towards others and to be respectful towards Mary and to not try to claim access to Mary's body, to not try to pursue what maybe he could get away with, but not to try to pursue that. That's not the kind of person that he is. And so Joseph has already been the right kind of man all the way through the story episode, in contrast to Judah. Ultimately, we can see that this is a summary statement of how it was that the father became the father. So in Judah's case, how did Judah become the father? Well, he didn't really know Tamar. I mean, he didn't know that it was Tamar that he knew, and then he didn't know her after that. And then in Joseph's case in Matthew chapter 1, well, how did Joseph become the father of Jesus? By not knowing Jesus' mother. That's how it happened, which is basically the opposite of how we might expect it to happen if we were to ask someone, how do parents normally become parents? How do fathers normally become fathers? Well, in terms of if we back in the time of Judah or back in the time of Joseph, people would say, well, there's usually the parents know each other. The parents have sexual intercourse. But this is what we're finding did not happen in the case of Judah and Tamar. And in Joseph's case, he never knew Mary. He never pursued Mary for sexual relations throughout the whole story episode of how it was that Joseph became the father of Jesus. Well, it happened. How did it happen? By Joseph not knowing Mary. Now, if we didn't study the parallel in Genesis 38 of how it was that Judah became the father of Perez and Zerah by not really knowing Tamar, then we wouldn't have seen all the parallels to help us to really unpack what's going on with Joseph. Why is the story so much about Joseph? Well, suddenly it all makes perfect sense. Of course it's a story about Joseph. Joseph looked like he wasn't going to claim paternity rights. Well, he wasn't going to become known as the father. He wasn't going to raise the child as his child because he thought that he wasn't the father. He thought that, that was the correct thing to do. If he's not the father, don't claim to be the father. But then he's told to be known as the father, and it all happened without him knowing the heir's mother. So that is the parallel story of how Joseph became the father of Jesus. Okay, so next time we've got the final question. We finally reached the why question. Why are there a total of 5 mothers in the Messiah's genealogy? We can see that the first mother is there to highlight how it was that Judah became the father of Perez and Zerah from Tamar. That's paralleling the story of how in the final case, where the final heir, how Joseph became the father of Jesus from Mary. These are the parallel stories. We can see that quite clearly. But why do we have 3 more stories? The writer has included 3 more stories that are highlighting 3 more paternities of how Salmon became the father of Boaz, how Boaz became the father of Obed, and how David became the father of Solomon. And there are 3 more stories. Why do we have a total of 5 mothers in the Messiah's genealogy? That is the question that we've been waiting to get to? That is the question next time in episode 10. Until then, thank you for listening to episode 9 of Masculinity.